On Primetime Politics, on the defensive.
We are the ones who are taking seriously Canada's defense needs.
A rare letter from U.S. senators forces the Prime Minister to justify his defense policy. American lawmakers accusing Canada of hurting collective defense by failing to meet its NATO commitments. We'll speak to our journalist panel about the letter's impact here in the nation's capital. And
under the Genocide Convention, Israel must immediately halt its military offensive.
The International Court of Justice says Israel must stop its Rafah offensive, and Canada says the ruling must be followed. What will that mean for relations with Israel? We will speak to Canada's ambassador to the UN, Bob Rae. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. The Prime Minister finds himself having to defend his NATO record. On Thursday, a group of U.S. senators wrote to Justin Trudeau telling him they are profoundly disappointed and concerned that Canada will not meet its 2% of GDP NATO commitment even by the end of the decade. It's a failure the senators say will harm the alliance and the free world. Here's how the Prime Minister responded on Friday.
And I will say, in the conversations I've had with my American colleagues and counterparts, the massive investments we're making in upgrading our fighter jet fleet with 88 new fighter jets, our investments close to $40 billion in NORAD modernization, our recent budget's massive investments in Arctic safety and security, recognizing NATO's western and northern flank is Canada's Arctic, are all extremely well received by the Americans and by allies around the world who want to see us continue to step up. We recognize there's more to do, and we will be there to do it.
Well, to talk about this, we're now joined by Robert Fife, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Stephanie Levitz, Deputy Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Robert Russo, veteran Ottawa journalist who's now with The Economist. Hello to the three of you.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
So, you know, it's rare. It's rare for U.S. senators to write to the head of a foreign government and say what they said. How embarrassing is this for Trudeau and his government? How embarrassing is this for Canada?
Well, it's not embarrassing. It's a lot more serious than that. We have some very serious negotiations coming up in terms of the renegotiation of the free trade agreement. And these senators are saying you got to put something on the table, and it's going to have to be something to do with defense. So it is a very serious issue. We've been getting away as being freeloaders for a long time, but the Americans, and you know, it's a very polarized society, but you've got Democrats and you've got Republicans that are on side that Canada and our other allies have to put a lot more money on the table, and we are seeing that. Our NATO allies are, in some cases, spending up to 3%, even though there's a 2% target, and we're at 1.7%. And even what we committed to is not committed to spending. That's just sort of kind of vague promises of doing something. So it's going to be a very embarrassing moment for the Prime Minister in Washington when the NATO leaders meet if he cannot put something more on the table. And I think there are going to be real consequences for this country unless we can really pony up to the bar and put real money and real commitments that we're going to do something.
Yeah, and two important points that you raised there. One, the fact that this was a bipartisan letter, both Democrats and Republicans, and two, there is this NATO meeting in Washington come July. Stephanie, what do you make of it?
Well, doesn't this just put the pin in the argument trying to be advanced by Trudeau and his cabinet that they're down in the U.S. right now making good relations and getting ready for the next Trump administration? Because clearly whatever it is they're talking to their American counterparts, they're not listening, because what the Americans want to hear is defense spending, please. And so it's a bit embarrassing for the Trudeau government, I think, in that context, because they did make this very big show of we're not going to, you know, get sleepwalked into a next Trump administration if there is one, da-da-da. And it sort of, again, puts the point, if we can say this, to about Justin Trudeau's longer-term commitment to defense, and should raise a question domestically right away to the Conservatives, okay, what is your plan then? Because if, you know, it could in fact be a Conservative government that is left dealing with the Trump administration, more demands on defense, and we still don't have clarity from the Tories about how they would even approach this really difficult issue. Yeah,
and underline the fact that it was Trump in his presidency that threw NATO up in the air, saying, you know, the United States can't be flipping the bill for everything. Rob, what do you say?
It is I think we should be abashed by this. It isn't just the Americans. I think we've all been to briefings where some of our European allies who are closer to what's going on in Ukraine than we are saying they're doing far, far more than 2%. They're looking at 5%. They're also looking at a more robust and a more rambunctious Russia that is casting its glance beyond Ukraine as well. We shouldn't be surprised. I mean, if you go back to John Manley said that we have the reputation of the people who, when the bill comes, we get up and we excuse ourselves to go to the washroom and wash our hands. Well, we're not doing that. Our allies are now saying, not only are you getting up and going to the washroom, you're going out the back, you're getting into the getaway car, which is running, and getting out of here as soon as you can. This is something, the call is coming from beyond the United States. It's coming from our other allies. But the other truth is, it's not a vote winner. It just doesn't seem to make a difference with Canadian voters. When political parties, like even the NDP tried this in 2008, they tried to have a more robust military platform. They found that they lost votes with it. Until we're actually threatened, it seems that chagrin and embarrassment doesn't seem to make this a vote getter. That changes if China and Russia become more expansionist than they're threatening to be now. But as it stands now, a lot of the people who run campaigns don't believe it's a vote getter.
Yeah, I would agree with you earlier, but the world's changed since then. And the Canadian, for a long period of time, Liberals, whether it was Jean Chrétien or Trudeau, was saying, look, Canadians don't really care about defense spending, so we're not going to spend a lot of money. If we have to cut, we'll always cut the defense budget. But the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine and is threatening Eastern Europe, and you have Germany, which all of a sudden has turned around and has spent billions and billions of dollars to rearm. All of France, all of these countries have done so. So has Japan because of the fear about Chinese expansionism. The world has changed, and that's why you're seeing all these NATO countries spending a lot of money now, and that's why the Americans are saying, hey, we're not going to foot all this stuff, and you better do something as well. And we better think about this. In the Arctic, where they want us to spend a lot more money than we've even committed to do, Russia has very sophisticated military bases up there, and we simply want to rely on F-35s or for the Americans in Alaska. No, that's not going to cut it anymore, particularly because China is now building nuclear icebreakers to come into there. So the world has changed, and I think Canadians are not stupid, and they understand that we have to. And we have a very proud tradition, by the way, a military tradition. When tough gets going, Canada's always there. And I think Canadians, my view is that Canadians will accept more defense spending because it's the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to that, it's interesting that you raise Alaska, because it makes me think of General Andrew Leslie's, retired General Andrew Leslie's letter or interview with the National Post, because here he is, a former member of the Trudeau cabinet, essentially saying that Justin Trudeau does not care about defense, or is at least not serious enough about defense. How does that affect the Prime Minister? Do you think, does it move him in any way, Stephanie, when there's a debate as to whether or not Canadians really care about investing in it?
Well, I mean, that presumes that Justin Trudeau ever cared about defense. I mean, in the entirety of his political career, it's not as though at one point in time he really cared and then stopped caring. It's not that he never cared and then he did. He doesn't evidence any care. And I think to Bob's point and a little bit to Rob's, Canadians, will care about the things that matter to them, obviously, but strong leadership means explaining to them and taking them along and saying, here is why this matters. And what is wrong with trying to drive Canadians to care about the military? What is wrong with saying to them, for example, hey, did you know that the armed forces can really provide your kid an education, and they can go to school, and then we could get your kid into the military, and then they'd have all these skills? I'm not saying that we should go to the American-style military culture. That is a different thing. It's a different economy. But Canadians will care if their leaders can show them the reason to care. If their leaders themselves don't care, that's what Canadians pick up on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, listen, I'm going to quickly move on, because before we're done, I also want to talk about the most recent Abacus poll. But I'm jumping in part because you talk about leadership. And yes, the Abacus poll shows us the Conservatives still have a massive lead over the Liberals. But what was interesting to me were the impressions and traits that Canadians have of the two leaders. Because when it comes to things like hiding their true values in order to get elected. Kindness and being too extreme. Canadians kind of give, if we have, and I believe we have the board here, Canadians give both Pierre Poilievre and Justin Trudeau equal marks. They are impressed, not impressed on equal levels on both of them. So what does that mean for the political parties as they try to set up into another campaign, do you think, Bob?
Well, it just shows that Canadians are actually pretty smart. Because they're seeing Trudeau, who's always practicing wedge politics consistently, but you also have Pierre Poilievre, who occasionally get these moments where he's kind of a nice guy and he's got a sense of humor, but then he quickly retreats back to the guy that we all know, which is kind of a nasty, mean guy. And you know, you watch Question Period and you see both of these people going at each other. You know, you're a white supremacist, you're anti-abortionist, you're worse than me. You're worse than me, yeah. And you know, all of that sort of stuff. And it's kind of depressing, to be frankly. Even all of us watching this stuff can not move on from this. So I just think the Canadians are bang on. They see it. I don't know what the end result is going to be. It's one of the things that I think that if Trudeau does leave and there's another, and the Liberals get another leader, that could be a game changer electorally, because I don't think people, they're fed up with Trudeau. They parking their votes with the Conservatives, but I'm not certain that Mr. Poilievre is a shoo-in if there's a new Liberal leader who can be positive.
Yeah, well, I think when you looked at the numbers, it looks like no Canadians really sold on either one very strongly. Although, you know, for me, what tweaked in my mind was if the Liberal campaign is going to be setting up as, you know, Poilievre is someone you can't trust, it's not as if Canadians say to look at Trudeau and say, oh, you're someone we can trust. What do you make of the numbers and the impact of it?
To Bob's point, one of the things we can make of the numbers is that some of the social programs that the Liberals have rolled out as part of their economic and social vision are things Canadians like. And the concern that Pierre Poilievre would do away with them is that maybe that sweet spot where if the Liberals did have a new leader, that could be the thing that shifts, because that new leader can say, hey, I'm going to protect your national daycare program. I'm going to protect your dental program. And it also means the pressure, you know, not unlike the conversation we were just having with the military, the pressure is going to be on Mr. Poilievre to explain and justify why he's going to do away with some of these programs and how he will untangle them. That's that's a lot harder to do, untangling a big national daycare program. That's hard to cut off at the knees without some kind of political repercussion.
A couple of things jumped out at me in the poll. Number one is time for a change versus re-elect the Liberals, and it was 54% for time for a change. Re-elect the Liberals was 17%. That tells me that no matter what Justin Trudeau might say about Pierre Poilievre, people have tuned him out. People don't want to hear it from him. They might want to hear it from somebody else, but they don't want to hear it from him. So scare tactics are going to be very, very difficult to convince voters to pay attention to those. The other thing that Mr. Poilievre needs to worry about is, as Stephanie said, he's rebuilt the Conservative Party. The people who have signed up and to support the Conservative Party and who are supporting them in polls now go beyond the base of his party. They're interested in social programs. Is he prepared to alienate those people, and can he afford to do so and maintain the lofty numbers that he has now? As Bob was saying, I'm not sure that he can, because while people have turned away from Mr. Trudeau, they haven't decided that Mr. Poilievre is the guy that they want to put their faith in. They know that they want to change, but I wouldn't call Mr. Poilievre a beloved figure. But maybe the Conservatives are banking on time for change, that number there, which is going to be a very, very difficult sentiment to try and change around a decade in. There's a diminishing power a prime minister has the longer he's in office. And Stephen Harper found this out in 2015. You can promise things and people just stop believing you, and it's beginning to look like they're either tuned out Mr. Trudeau or they stop believing him.
Well, we continue to watch. Always appreciate our time together. Bob, Stephanie, Rob, thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Well, time now for a look at what else happened in politics on Friday. Workers at the Canada Border Services Agency have voted to approve a strike mandate, one that could happen as early as June, which could result in significant delays for Canadians trying to cross the border. PSAC, which represents the CBSA's roughly 9,000 members, says workers are looking for fair wages, flexible remote work options, and equitable retirement benefits, among other demands. In a statement, the Treasury Board says it is fully committed to reaching a fair and reasonable agreement for Border Services employees, but they also note 90% of frontline border workers are considered essential, meaning they would be required to work even during a strike. The Conservative Party is saying no to Kevin Vuong. The independent MP was dropped as a Liberal candidate in 2021, and he told the Canadian press he had asked Pierre Poilievre to join the Conservative team. Vuong has voted several times with the opposition Conservatives, but party spokesperson Sarah Fisher tells CPAC the party is not considering welcoming Vuong into the Conservative caucus.
Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
That was the ruling delivered by the International Court of Justice looking into Israel's offensive into Gaza. In addition to the stop in fighting, the court is calling on Israel to reopen the Rafah crossing for humanitarian aid and is calling on Hamas to release all remaining Israeli hostages. Rulings from the court are legally binding, but the ICJ does not have any mechanism with which to enforce them. Israel has already rejected the ruling. Well, for some reaction to the ICJ ruling, we're now joined by Canada's ambassador to the UN, Bob Rae. Ambassador Rae, thank you for taking the time.
It's a pleasure, Michael. Good to talk to you.
The Prime Minister, he says that the ruling from the ICJ today essentially are binding and that Canada expects everyone to comply with them. But is that just lip service, though? Because the ICJ has really no way of enforcing this ruling.
Well, you know, that's one of the central dilemmas of international law. It goes back a long way. It goes back several hundred years, Michael. So the enforcement mechanisms are much less clear in international law than they are if you run a red light, and that's one of the problems that we have. But the Prime Minister did make it clear that he feels he considers the decisions to be binding, and we do consider them to be binding and binding on us. We don't think we can pick and choose which things we like and which things we don't like. Fundamentally, we have to look at a court which has been established for several decades. It's been supported by countries around the world, including Russia, the United States, and other countries. And we see no reason not to indicate our strong support for the court. At the same time, we have to remember that this is not only a directive towards Israel, it's a directive towards Hamas. It says Hamas should release the hostages. We've been saying that since October the 7th. We now find out that Hamas has taken hostages, and which were not real life people, they're dead bodies. And they brought them back to Gaza, and they've kept them, pretending that they were people who could be traded for their own prisoners in Israeli jails. So, I mean, the conduct here is atrocious, and we need to understand that if there is a ceasefire negotiation, which we think there will be this weekend, we hope that it succeeds. We hope that we can avoid the level of civilian loss of life, which we've seen. But none of us should be under any illusions that this is easy. But we are supportive of what we can do, what we must do, to protect civilian life and to understand that even in the worst conflicts, there are rules.
Mm-hmm. So what can Canada do? You know, if it is binding on all, including Israel, Hamas, and on Canada, what effectively can this country do to exert pressure to make sure that this CJ ruling is actually followed?
Well, I mean, look at what we have done. We've made it clear that we consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization. We've issued sanctions against the leadership of the country and placed every form of economic and other limitation we can on on their conduct. That is what we can do from this vantage point. We've also made it clear to Israel that we will not be supportive. We're not supportive of continuing carrying out a war in Gaza, which has an intolerable effect on human life, on civilian infrastructure, and that is not something we can say we're quite happy with. We're not happy with it, and we do think it poses a real problem for Israel, as much as it poses a problem for the innocent civilians who are living in Gaza. And this is not a new notion. Yes, countries can defend themselves. Yes, they have rights under international law. If your country has been invaded, you can respond. There are wars of self-defense. But even a war of self-defense has to follow the basic requirements of international law with respect to the protection of civilians.
Now, it has been suggested that Canada actually pursue an arms embargo against Israel, also impose sanctions on Israel's war cabinet. At what point would that be possible? Is that ever possible?
Well, we've already indicated. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about arms embargoes with respect to Israel. Canada is not a major military supplier to Israel at all, and we never have been. But we have made it clear that we will not be supplying weaponry that we think it's potentially going to be used in the conflict directly in Gaza. At the same time, we have said that we believe, because Israel has the right to self-defense, that if there's material that, for example, allows the Iron Dome to work, then we're not going to withhold that from Israel. So we're trying to walk a path that we think is principled and practical. We want to maintain an open dialogue with the government of Israel about why we think it's important for certain rules to be observed and why it's in the interest of Israel to be thinking through more carefully the need for a two-state solution. Ironically, one that Mr. Netanyahu himself talked about in 2009. So we need to understand that the creation of an effective Palestinian state is in the interest of the people of Israel as much as it's in the interest of the Palestinians.
Is that even possible, though, given what we are witnessing right now, given just how violent it has become? Is a two-state solution even a real possibility?
Well, Germany and France managed to talk to each other after the Second World War. That was pretty destructive. No one should assume that war is a permanent condition of the human species. It is a terrible thing, and it's very destructive, and it has horrendous impact on people and their families and the human community. But don't say that it's impossible for countries to talk to each other when a war is over. The challenge of this war is that it is a war that it dramatically affects civilians, and that in the case of Hamas, it's a war that's being carried out by a terrorist organization, and they are deliberately going after civilians, and there's a difference between deliberately going after civilians and the fact that in a war people are killed. But the issue in this issue in Gaza is, I think the court has made its ruling. The negotiations that have been underway for a substantial period of time are all about how do we protect human life and how do we ensure that the rules of war are observed. And that's something we consistently have to do.
I wonder how you feel then, because, you know, Israel, and I know you know this, has already rejected this ruling. Benny Gantz, a member of the Israeli War Cabinet, he said his country is essentially obliged to continue fighting. He also says that Israel will follow international law and try to avoid harming civilians. What do you make of that response then? And I hear what you're saying, that Canada is trying to walk a fine line here, but when Israel clearly says it rejects the ruling, what's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is to say we all have to follow the rules. And my second reaction is to say Israel has had several discussions with Hamas in the last 4 months about a ceasefire. So I mean, would they be entering into a ceasefire negotiation if they didn't recognize that there was a problem with the way in which the war was being conducted? They want to get the hostages out, and the court has said that to Hamas, you have to release the hostages. So there's now a negotiation going on between the parties, which will in effect, if it leads to a ceasefire, will in effect adopt the ruling of the court. So let's try to be consistent here and understand that there will have to be a ceasefire if the hostages are going to be released in the way in which this war is now structured. It's a terrible thing. But Israel would not have entered into these negotiations several times in the past 4 months and would not have actually carried out a swap of hostages for prisoners and a short ceasefire if they didn't realize that this was something that was in their interests to do as much as anyone else's. But I do think we have to be clear here about the importance of having laws and the importance of respecting laws and of understanding that the failure to live up to the law has consequences. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's not clear. The issue of enforcement of international law has bedeviled international law from the very get-go, but we need to understand that it is a form of rules-based behavior that is actually in the interest of everyone, not just in the interests of one group or another.
Ambassador Bob Rae, I always appreciate the time. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.
And you. And that is Primetime Politics for today. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back next week. Until then, take care.